Kelly sat by his side, hands folded over a coffee cup that had gone cold. She had learned the rhythms of the hospital, the hours when the light fell just right, the moments when the corridor felt ghostly, the way certain nurses hummed soft, human songs as they made their rounds. She read to him sometimes, not because Mark needed the words, but because speaking them filled the room with the ordinary texture of life. Grocery lists that had turned into love notes, a silly joke from an old show that always made him wince and then laugh, a photograph from a fishing trip when neither of them had the slightest idea how to bait a hook. The diagnosis they had kept private had been a slow, creeping presence. It arrived at first like an inconvenient knock, and then moved into the house, refusing to leave. The phrase chronic felt at once clinical and cruel. Chronic meant there would be many mornings like this, many cups of coffee cooling untouched, many ways to measure the erosion. They had made choices, not about whether to fight, because the instinct to fight was reflexive and fierce, but about where to fight it. The hospital was their picket line. The cameras were not. The decision to keep the diagnosis under wraps had not been a cold calculation. It was a conversation held in the half-light of their kitchen, hands wrapped around mugs, laughter forcing its way into an otherwise terrible night. There were practical reasons to protect the children's privacy, to let Mark live as Mark and not as a story. There were stubborn ones, too, the belief that not every war needs to be a public spectacle. In the end, privacy felt like a fragile, hopeful kind of dignity. When the doctor stepped into the room, his face carried a familiarity born of witnessing too many endings. He sat quietly, placed a folder on the chair, and inhaled. There are rhythms to this kind of conversation, a grammar of kindness that medicine teaches its messengers, a careful preface, the necessary truth spoken clearly, a pause that lets them settle. We did everything we could. I'm so sorry. He's gone. Kelly felt as though a hand had closed over the top of her chest. For a moment she could not move, not because she was frozen by shock, but because the body was slow to accept a change. This absolute, Mark's hand in hers, was thin and warm. Machines continued their polite beeping, the hospital's indifferent orchestra. She cried, not the cinematic wail fed to cameras and headlines, but a real, gradual breakdown, the kind that begins in the shoulders and trickles down into a soul. Her grief had no punctuation. It came in sobs, long intakes of air, absurd, fleeting thoughts that maybe she could bargain with the universe, trade something she loved for the return of a voice. Word leaked out because the world leaks. Privacy is porous. An aid had slipped. A drone of rumor buzzed, and soon the story found its edges in a corner of the internet that loves to turn private pain into public spectacle. Kelly could have stayed silent. She could have let the story ferment into rumor and bloodless headlines. Instead, she made a different choice. She would tell the truth in her own voice, on her own terms. The letter she wrote that night was not a manifesto. It was a note, a careful human accounting of what had happened, why they had chosen privacy, and what Mark had meant to the people who loved him. She kept it simple. She named the diagnosis for clarity, not sensationalism. She described the treatments they had pursued, the nights they had stayed awake trying to make the next morning easier. Most of all, she wrote about Mark as he had always been to her, a man who made ordinary things feel like tiny miracles. When she stepped in front of the cameras to read the statement the next week, there was a steadying restraint to her voice. Media outlets wanted the big reveal because the clock runs on curiosity. Kelly's reveal, however, felt like quiet repair. She chose precision over flourish. She did not ask for sympathy. She asked for one thing only, the same dignity she and Mark had sought while he was alive. We wanted to keep this private because we needed to live as a family without the constant glare. She said, "I loved him, he fought, we grieved in quiet." The public reaction was immediate and noisy. Some accused her of secrecy, of withholding from fans a matter of public interest. Many more thanked her for protecting what was most sacred. In the weeks that followed, the conversation shifted from speculation to a more humane question. When does a public figure owe the public a confession? And when do they owe themselves the right to grieve? The hospital memories remained vivid. Ward A, bed 12, the rhythm of the 4. The nurse who told a story about Mark making paper boats with a child who couldn't sleep. A doctor who had become less a stranger and more a guardian of small comforts. Kelly revisited those scenes in the quiet of the night and found that grief carried with it a ridiculous litter of anecdote. The thing Mark said to make a nurse laugh in the middle of a sleepless shift. The crumpled baseball he had slept beside in the margin of an old script. A joke that never made it to air. People brought flowers, casseroles, a neighbor's hug at the door. Despite the infrastructure of celebrity, the rituals of mourning were ordinary and relentless. Those ordinary rituals gave Kelly something to hold on to. Casserole plates stacked in the sink, friends who wanted to give instead of take, the small kind of normalcy that moves like a bandage across a wound. Friends in the business reached out not as network colleagues, but as fellow humans. Some calls were clumsy apologies, fumbling for the right words. Others offered steadier kindness, a memory of a laugh, a story of the way Mark had shown up at a fundraiser and left with more smiles than the evening had started with. Those stories became a mosaic of his life, not the polished image that interviews constructed, but the messy, beautiful truth of him. The letter Kelly wrote, the one she read aloud, became more than an accounting of illness. It became, unexpectedly, an ethical study. Columnists debated whether public figures have obligations to disclose illness. Ethicists weighed in on the responsibilities of fame. The police of public opinion lined up on both sides, declaring verdicts without having been in the room. Kelly watched from a smaller perspective, as someone who loved a person whose life had always been partly in windows. She thought about what it meant to live in the eye of a camera while keeping a private life. She thought about their children and what it would mean to have childhoods turned into a public catalog of sorrow. Each of those calculations had been a heavy pebble dropped into the jar of decision-making. There were moments of contradiction. She felt guilty for not telling earlier, and yet she was proud of the night they had chosen to protect their family. She felt the pain of speculation and the relief that came from choosing the narrative on their terms. The media moved on, as it always does, but Kelly found that moving on did not mean forgetting. It meant learning to live with the presence of absence. A memorial was organized not as a spectacle, but as a gathering of people who had shared stages, sets, kitchens, and backyards. It was full of both polished tributes and raw human eulogies. One of Mark's old co-stars spoke about how he would arrive on set with someone else's bad coffee and turn it into a joke that made half the crew laugh so hard they forgot to be nervous. A nurse from Ward A told a story about him making Sundays special for a pediatric patient, then joking that he should start a side business. These small stories knit together into a picture of a man who lived with an open, generous heart, someone whose life had been stitched from the ordinary and the unspectacular. Afterwards, the city felt different for Kelly. The places that had been mundane, a corner cafe, a clinic, the studio steps, carried memory like autumn carried leaves. She learned to navigate a new geography of absence. There were days when it was unbearable, and days when it was simply another part of the background, like the hum of a refrigerator. The diagnosis itself, the medical facts, became less interesting to the public than the private ethics of how they had handled it. People debated the labels and medical terms, but those debates always returned to the human core, a family trying to steward their time together in the only way they could. Kelly's statement had asked, at its heart, for what most grieving people ask for: tolerance from the public, tenderness from a press, a place to breathe without being reduced to a narrative. Months later, Kelly found ways to honor what had been lost without performing grief. She hosted a small charity event that raised money for a clinic in need, naming it with a private joke that made a few people laugh. She started a tradition with her children on the anniversary of Mark's death: a morning walk, a ridiculous breakfast, a small ritual of saying out loud the trivial joys that had made him smile. These tiny observances were, in a way, how she translated privacy into public legacy, not by creating a spectacle, but by building something that could help others. The tension between private life and public celebrity never entirely vanished. There were intrusive questions at times, opinions offered with the authority of strangers, and there were moments when Kelly